So resistance or friction or tension is how we shape clay, and it's how we're shaped. And so this idea that somehow it's right with God when everything's working perfectly is an illusion.
Yeah.
There's challenges every day.
Yeah.
Right, throughout the day. And when we keep thinking that God makes everything easy, we've missed the Gospels.
All right. Well, welcome to our AWI podcast. This is a time for authentic conversation surrounding Christian worship, theology, and leadership. And today we will be talking about, we'll be doing our third episode of the Avenues of Worship through the Arts series. And we're going to be talking about visual arts today and a little specific focus on ceramics with our guest, Bill Catling. And we are very excited to have you. You're actually my ceramics professor. And so I walked into the ceramics room and met you for the first time. And yeah, do you want to talk about a little bit of your art background and ceramic background?
Sure. It was great meeting you in the ceramics room. It's a great place for, I think, conversations about life, conversations about art, worship, God. I've had my hands in clay since I was a little boy. Grew up on a ranch up in the Bay Area. And our property had a lot of clay beds on it.
That's awesome.
So I grew up digging clay up out of the earth, making things out of it. And then my education, I was an art major. I did 3 college degrees.
Wow.
Yeah.
What were all the degrees?
I did a double major in painting and sculpture at San Francisco State, which was fantastic. It was in the early 70s, a wild time. And to be a person of faith in the midst of that, it was always, I ended up being pastoral to everyone because everyone was falling apart. And,
so life sometimes falls apart.
Exactly. And then I went on and did a master's in sculpture there as well. And then when we moved down here for me to teach at Azusa Pacific, that was in 1991. My master's wasn't considered terminal, so I went back to school and got my MFA, Master's in Fine Arts, at Cal State Fullerton.
Nice.
Yeah, and I just loved art my whole life and loved God since I knew about him. I did not grow up in a Christian home. In fact, I was just thinking this morning, for some reason as a 10-year-old, my parents enrolled me in a summer Bible study thingy.
And they weren't Christians?
No, not at all.
And they just, whoa.
Yeah, and it was this pink cinder block Lutheran church. I remember the color, the texture of the building, of course. And my favorite thing about that week is I made a plaster boat and painted the sail, painted everything. And I was thinking that I've been making boats in clay and in wood and branches almost my entire life.
Wow.
So that connection was really powerful.
Yeah, that's crazy. When was a moment for you growing up when you were like, oh, I want to do art for the rest of my life?
I don't think I've ever thought of anything else.
Really?
Yeah.
So it was just like kind of all you knew?
It's what I loved. It's what my go-to.
Obvious.
I was drawing, had my hands in clay, painting. I was painting for a very long time. And it makes no sense. My family didn't know what to do with me.
Yeah.
And so I was sure that aliens dropped me into this family because there was no way we were the same DNA.
Yeah.
My dad was an ex-Marine, Pacific Theater, a construction worker, cowboy. My mom was a stay-at-home mom. And I was into art. And growing up on this ranch, it didn't really make any sense. But I feel like God put it in me my whole life.
Yeah. Well, that's crazy that even like you literally could make clay out of like what was around you.
It was fabulous.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's awesome.
And the clay was a purplish gray color I'll never forget. And it smelled bad because of the vegetation rotting in it.
There you go.
So none of our parents cared about us. They would let us go play in it and just kept us away. And it was just this magical moments on these ranches and with all the neighbor kids and just sitting there for hours.
What was your first creation? Was it the boat that was, or was it something
No, I
before
remember
then?
I was about 5 or 6 at a relative's house. Everyone's in the living room being loud, which my family was very loud. And I was very quiet until much later in life. And I was in this back bedroom with red and blue Play-Doh. And I made this dog, red dog with a big blue ear.
Nice.
And in my brain, I can see it just as clear as when I made it a very long time ago. So I've always found myself off to the side being creative.
Yeah.
But no one said that was okay. There was no one talking about the fact that creatives have a different way of thinking about life.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which I was just about to ask about that, of like, how was that growing up with your parents not really understanding you, with people around you not really understanding you?
Made me strong.
Yeah. Yeah.
It made me independent in my thinking. I never was bored.
Yeah.
I've always had something to work on, sketchbooks. All my emotive stuff as a teenager came through drawings and all that angst of teenage years, which doesn't seem to change generation to generation.
Yeah.
It seems to come with high school and junior high and all of those things. And I was very fortunate. It was fall of my freshman year. I was kidnapped by Young Life.
Okay. Scared me for a second.
They cleared it with parents,
Okay.
but I didn't know what was coming. And these big guys came in the house, grabbed me, put me in the back of a camper van filled with other freshmen.
Nice.
And kidnap night was how many kids could they get to the Young Life house.
Wow.
So there were hundreds of us crammed in this house. And I fell in love with Young Life. So I was involved. I was converted the next year at a Young Life camp up at Mount Herman,
Wow.
Santa Cruz, and ended up volunteering in Young Life as a leader for many years. Yeah. It was a very transformational experience.
Yeah. Yeah. So you knew about God before Young Life, but that was when you became a Christian.
I didn't know much.
Yeah.
There was no conversation.
Except for that one Bible class.
Yep. And then I often heard the word God connected with swear phrases. So that was common in my experience. But meeting Christ through Young Life was very powerful.
Yeah. When did God become a part of your art?
I think from the initial experience, I felt like Christ called me as a whole person into him. And I was very fortunate to have that mindset. So I've always tried to lead what I call one life, everything connected.
Yeah.
So my creativity seemed like a natural part of my faith. My favorite set of words in Scripture are the first 5 words in English. In the beginning, God created, right? It's 3 words in Hebrew. So that was all I needed. You know, I joke sometimes about everything after that's an appendix. Yeah. The power of that phrase. Yeah. That God identifies himself as a creative being. Yeah. And we're made in that image.
Right. Yeah. And when that's what's so powerful about creativity is, just like you said, it is all of one life. It's your mind, it's your body, it's your soul, it's your spirit, and it's everything in one when you're being creative. Right. And like the Creator created us, and even if it's not through different like art forms, it's like we're all creative in our own ways. Right. Whether we see it that way or not. Right. But he has absolutely created us to also create things, and like we're made in the image of God, so therefore we're supposed to replicate that. And
I think if we live a segmented life, it's difficult.
Totally.
And sometimes education keeps us in little boxes. But if we can break through into a unified experience, that we see our lives as connected. Yeah. So our creativity is not just a product. It's how we think. It's how we dress. It's how we drive. I mean, we need more Christian drivers.
That's true.
I don't think Christ is represented well on the freeway.
Yeah.
But, you know, how do we do that? And I think I have this idea that I think we need to plug in and never unplug. So that worship, prayer is a nonstop part of our lives. And so our creative life embraces this connectivity. You know, that beautiful description of the vine and the branches. Yep. Our only job is to stay plugged in.
Yeah, and connected.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I actually just went to this lecture recently where the person giving the lecture talked about how thought is the secular word for praying. and how if we're like the more I thought about it, the more I was like, when we actually dwell on our thoughts and when we actually follow where the thought leads us, typically we actually find God in it.
Right.
And it's like we're actually spending time with him the more we unplug from technology,
right.
but like plug into creation, right. plug into creativity and what's around us.
And we only actually have to do it once.
Right. True.
And then live it out.
Yes. And continue
right.
and look around and
yeah, actually in Thessalonians, when Paul says pray without ceasing,
mm-hmm.
it's 3 kinds of prayer. It's our mind, our bodies, and our actions, which is really cool.
I love that.
Yeah, so then we're vehicles of prayer and worship. Our mind is the center of prayer and worship.
Yes.
And our actions are reflective of prayer and worship.
Yes.
It's really beautiful.
Yeah.
And that's a creative way of thinking.
Mm-hmm.
Because so many of us are trained to, we have to do things to earn God's love.
Right, which is not it.
Right. So we have those beautiful badges saying I'm busy for Jesus, which doesn't seem to be what Christ wants.
No. And some people say busy stands for being under Satan's yoke. So.
Oh, that's interesting. I haven't heard that one.
It's not, yeah. And it's an acronym, but yeah,
right.
There is something to it of when we're busy, we're distracted and we miss what's right in front of us. Right. And I think more times than not, spending time with God is just opening your eyes and opening your mind to what's right in front of you and entering into his presence, because he's always with us.
Right.
But it's whether or not we choose to sit with him or not.
Or walk with him.
Right.
Or drive with him.
Well, in the beginning,
or brush our teeth with him.
Totally. Well, and I think more than anything, God just wants us to walk with him. Like that's what he did with Adam in the garden. Yeah. And that's what, even when they sinned, he was like ready for his walk.
Right.
And so the more times we can just walk with him and spend time with him.
That's where the plug-in is so powerful.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't have to like reinvent it. We don't have to like find a certain emotional state to have it.
Yeah.
It just becomes so normal. It's almost weird. It's almost too easy.
Right.
Right. And so if we are plugged in, that's a creative act because Genesis sets up this pattern for seasonal creativity, right? Everything is reproduced after its own kind. This creative reproduction of life, the creative reproduction of fruitfulness. And so when the fruits of the Spirit are described, I ask myself, okay, what does the seed of love look like?
Well,
what's a seed of forgiveness or patience? How do we plant seeds in this season so that when the harvest comes, we're ready to be loving? And I haven't figured that out yet, but I'm thinking about it a lot.
I love that. That's a very tangible way to think of it.
Right.
Yeah.
It doesn't happen magically, or it kind of does in a way, but we have to be intentional about the planting and the setting up the stage for that. So the creative process is very much like this, right? We have to set aside seasons of alone time to be thoughtful, to be drawing.
To have that reflection.
Yes. I think of studio spaces as a sacred space and enter it very prayerfully, even though it's hard work.
Right.
Right?
Right.
People in the ceramics talk a lot about the feeling of being centered.
Yeah.
Right? The working on the wheel, the clay centers us.
Yes.
Right? We think we're centering the clay, but...
Yeah. In fact, do you want to expand on ceramics and how tied to God that is?
Oh, yeah, it's beautiful. I joke about it being God's favorite material because Adam or Adama means red earth or clay, that we're made out of a substance very similar to clay. We're almost all water with some minerals and other stuff thrown in there, same way clay is. And so Paul talks about these earthen vessels, us as earthen vessels, contain a treasure. And so ceramics, you're making vessels hopefully of meaning. Right. Is it a special mug for a friend? Is it a bowl that's an offering? Right. And so I think clay is so like us. It's fragile and super strong. Right, at different stages of making it, right? You know, when it's wet and pliable, you can do anything you want with it. And then the water leaves, it gets brittle and fragile. And when it goes through the kiln, or we call it life, it gets tougher and stronger. So I see clay as a beautiful picture of the way God works with us. And God's the potter, we're the clay. Some of us are made into beautiful teacups for fine use, and others might be sewer pipes where we drain away the detritus of life because we are listeners. We're counselors. We're there when people are in their deepest grief. Wow. And so we all have a purpose. We all have a different kind of vessel that we are.
Right.
And sometimes we're more than one kind of vessel. You know, depending on the situation, may call for us to be just a simple clay mug, just to be a friend, to be a partner with someone. Other times we're meant to run in higher circles and be more refined.
Right.
Yeah. So it's this beautiful thing that when we see God creatively and we can be more adaptable, we're not stuck in a certain role.
Right. Oh, and that's even like, I mean, clay, you specifically mold it into, yes, exactly the specific creations and functions and vessels. Right. But it can be reformed even in the process of, I mean, there's been many times where you start creating and you have a different thing in mind of what you're going to create, and then either you slightly mess up or like an quote unquote accident happens, but I know you don't even like calling it that because then it turns into a whole different creation. And I remember that actually happened with me. I think I was just trying to create a bowl, and then I like hit it weird on the wheel, and then I turned it into like a gravy pour. Right. And it totally looked like it was intentionally that way from the beginning.
When it's good, it's always intentional.
Yeah, there you go. Yes.
But life is meant to be stumbled through. It's not meant to be walked always perfect.
Yeah.
Like think about toddlers when they learn to walk. They fall all the time. And no one's upset with them for falling.
True.
But when we get older, we start having higher expectations of each other. And I think falling should be more normal. And plus, you have a great view of the sky.
Good point.
Right.
Yeah. It gives you a wider lens to see.
Yeah. And so then we just reach down and pick people up instead of judging them for falling. We bring them back and embrace them. And then it's so much richer and less critical, right? We're so quick to judge people that stumble and fall. And it's like, that is just life.
Yeah.
Right. We just, I try so hard to drive well. It's really difficult, right? But I want to be filled with the Spirit when I drive, to be more patient, to let people cut me off the whole time. Sometimes I'm just not in that place. It's very challenging, and life is like that, right?
Right.
And the creative process is filled with problem solving and what we call mistakes or accidents or, what's going wrong. My mentor, a clay sculptor, felt that when things were going wrong, in some strange way, they're actually going right.
Because we don't always see what God is like doing and how he's working through it all.
Right. We forget that control is an illusion.
Right.
And we think we are in control.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and pain, even though we don't enjoy it, is actually like the biggest like lesson in and of itself. And if we don't experience pain, then we don't know that there's something wrong to be fixed and to be paid attention to.
That's right.
Yeah. To shift gears a little bit, I would love to ask how you would define worship.
Oh, that's a great question. Because I think, like prayer without ceasing, I think worship without ceasing.
Absolutely.
It's bodily.
Yep.
It's everything about us. It's a dedicated experience to worship God with our lives. And then corporate worship, when we come together to celebrate, has a certain heightened experience. And the more people that are walking in worship all the time increases the power of our community worship, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so I think worship is like prayer. It's the way we attune our mind. It's the way we think about life and what we're doing. And we see it as an act of worship to live in a certain way, to be ambassadors for Christ, right? Especially not just on Sundays or Wednesdays.
Yep.
but on Saturdays and
every day
commuting.
To always be plugged in.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
That prayer and worship are almost inseparable.
Yep.
Worship has a more intentional sense of, it's not my power.
Yeah,
it's God's
unto
power.
God.
Yes,
the focus is fully on the Lord.
And prayer is more about trying to keep ourselves in tune and aligned. And worship is an act of saying, I can't control this thing.
Right.
And I want to desperately.
Right. And I'm going to turn my face upon you.
That's right.
And
that's right.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then I think you said a key word earlier. You said pay attention. And I think it's one of the most important disciplines we can have in our lives. Because if we pay attention, then we worship God in the shadow and in the sunlight.
Yeah.
In the gray gloom of May and the glorious sunshine of July, right? We begin to see God's face or God's presence in all aspects of life. And then if we are paying attention, we hear God.
Yep.
Everywhere. In fact, I don't think he ever stops speaking to us. We just don't know how to listen.
Correct.
And when we set our hearts to worship without ceasing, to pray without ceasing, there's this comforting dialogue that comes from that.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so I see it as really powerful and challenging and difficult. But when it's working, it's amazing.
Right.
We endure the difficulties in a much better frame of mind.
Yeah, because we're always connected. We're always seeing how it constantly paying attention allows you to, even in the midst of the pain, even in the midst of the things that are that's not what I thought was going to happen.
Right.
You still see the ways that the Lord's working. And I think the practice of gratitude is often such a, that helps you enter into worship.
Right.
Because it's you focusing on the Lord and focusing on what he is doing that I can be grateful for, even amidst all X, Y, and Z of what is painful, what is hard.
Right.
But at the same time, being grateful for the pain, because there's so much beauty in that. And it's beauty from ashes. Ceramics, prime example, it's hard work.
Yep.
You have to really put your whole body into it. You have to, you could describe it much better than me, but in order to center, you have to use both your arms and your legs and just the force that you have to put into it.
Right.
And that is pain, but it creates a beautiful product.
But when you find the center, it seems effortless.
Right.
Right. It's a beautiful picture of our time with God. All of our effort to get there, when we land there, it's this is too easy.
Right. And then you're able to shape it exactly how.
That's right.
Yeah.
And then we can be shaped the way we should be shaped. So resistance or friction or tension is how we shape clay, and it's how we're shaped. And so this idea that somehow it's right with God when everything's working perfectly is an illusion.
Yeah.
There's challenges every day.
Yeah.
Right? Throughout the day. And when we keep thinking that God makes everything easy, we've missed the Gospels.
Right.
Right? We've missed the suffering of Christ.
Yeah.
When he asks us to share in that suffering, it's not the part of the faith that I'm excited about sometimes.
Right.
But the people of faith in Hebrews are killed. And I'm always like, God, is there another way we can do this? But I think what he wants to have killed in us is our perfectionism, our thinking that we know better than God, that we have the answers. And so the death of those things, the death of our ego, only happens when we lose control. And we realize we don't have control. Sickness, injury, accident, loss, right? Starting from that pet that gets lost when you're little and you experience death in the first time, or a parent, or that's really when we find ourselves closest to God, when we're at the end of ourselves.
Yes. Yeah. Well, it reminds us that it's not up to us. We can't do it on our own strength. And it reminds us of our fragility, of I'm actually so much weaker, so much more fragile than I thought. And therefore, I can't do it on my own strength and my own power. I need someone greater, which is God.
Well, and it's not something we want to choose.
Yeah.
It's not something we do choose. It's something that happens to us And our choice is how do we respond to that. So there's a beautiful process in ceramics called kintsugi, where a broken piece of ceramics is reassembled and gold is put in the cracks.
I think that's so beautiful.
And so if we see Christ as the gold in our lives, and the cracks are what lets the light in, then we have this restoration of our brokenness through the healing power of Christ. I think being broken is kind of normal.
Yep.
It's not what we want. But only when we're broken can we actually be restored.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And I think the restoration problem is we get often tied up or caught up restoring other people's lives. And Nehemiah has this beautiful picture of restoring the walls of Jerusalem. And our job is only to repair the wall where we live. We're not to go over to someone else's house. Because then our house is the vulnerability to the community.
Right.
So it's not selfish. It's we got to fix the problems in our lives.
Before we can fix other people.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And then when we have healthy boundaries and we have a restoration of spirit, then our kind of unit as part of this community is safe and solid. And it's a tough one. But again, it's creative. You're building a wall. You're assembling clay bricks. Right, you're putting something together, and it can be done beautifully. It doesn't have to just be this like simple brick facade.
Right.
It can have edges and garlands and part of a garden. Right. Then we're back in the garden.
Yep.
Restoring it. When the Israelites were in the desert and they built the tabernacle, if you look at all the description, it's a portable garden.
Whoa.
It's all about blossoms. It's all about plants. It's all about refreshment. And it's where there were no rivers. Yeah. They went from the Nile for 400 years to a place where there were no rivers. There was only oasis springs that they had to move from.
Right.
So the portable worship center becomes a portable garden image.
Whoa, I've never seen that. That's crazy.
It's really fun to think about. Yeah. I think about it a lot because it's about artists.
Right. Well, the whole tabernacle, the whole building of it is like so artistic.
Yes.
Of like all the different curtains, all the different like the gold and like I mean it's so descriptive in the Bible, but I can't fully even imagine what like it fully looked like.
No, I've seen people that have tried to render it.
Yeah.
And it's fun. But this idea that you have these two young artists that are put in charge of this creative project. They had to be over 10 studios they had to build in the desert for all the different mediums that they were using.
Whoa.
Wood and dye and perfume and all these things. And they all had teams of people working. And they were all under this direction. So here we have 14 chapters dedicated to art, which is a lot.
Yeah.
Right. So it makes me think God cares about art and creativity.
Correct.
Because this worship center where people would be connected to God was intended to be a creatively, visually inspiring space. And I think in our holiness tradition, when we've gone from the cathedrals of Europe to gymnasiums as our worship space, we've lost something.
Yeah.
We've gained maybe a simplicity of spirit.
Totally.
Right. And a lack of overdoneness. Right?
Yeah.
I don't know if that's the right word or not. But I think we've also lost
some of the beauty.
Something with it.
Yeah. I'm a sucker for stained glass.
Yes.
When I see stained glass in churches, I just think it's absolutely gorgeous. And it draws me into worship more.
Right.
Which is something that I miss in some church buildings, where it's just a
box.
Yeah, plain thing.
It's almost like the box stores that took out all the small hardware stores. We have these box churches. It's still amazing. Life happens in there. God is present. But we have lost. Now, sometimes it's replaced with all the digital slides.
Yeah.
Right? Those become our stained glass windows. And when it's done thoughtfully,
it's still beautiful.
It's powerful because, again, it's light and color, right?
Yep.
But often I don't think churches have a clear kind of platform for creative expression. So it's just someone good on the computer who's downloading images off the internet and popping up behind the lyrics, which is okay, but it could be. What if the images were tied into the sermon series? What if everything was interlinked? And so that, if we saw something up there, it would connect with the words that are being said. To me, now some churches do that.
Yeah.
Right? It's very powerful.
Yeah. I'm fortunate my church is very good at connecting all of like the visual effects, lights. One of the lighting person at my church, he blows me away how it's such an act of worship for him, and how he connects it to the music, to the hits of the drum, it takes him a lot of time, but it's like when we like play the song, it just enhances the worship experience, if you want to call it that, so much more, and totally brings glory to God. And so I had a question off of that too, of artists in the church, whether lighting, whether whatever, but I guess also my question is specifically like visual artists. How should the church approach that? Right.
Well, one, artists are different. Creatives are different. We do things like daydream, drift off. We're always late. We have all these things that are part of our nature and our character. So sometimes we're not sure how we fit in, because what's described as normal makes us feel different and awkward and out of place. So some of it's just seeing that creatives are not wrong or off, but difference is a beautiful part of God's community. And so that is a huge step to make creatives feel welcome, right? Even though they're late, or they come at the wrong time, or they're doodling during a sermon, right? I talk to artists when I train artists to distinguish between their personal, professional art and devotional art. That there's an art we make for a worshipful setting, I call devotional art, or that leads into a deeper worship. Sometimes churches open their narthex up to art shows, and the wrong art is brought in. It's people's personal, professional art comes in, and it's jarring. It doesn't fit. It's made for a different purpose. And I think we need to be really clear about the visuals that we bring in are to enhance worship. Like the old icons did. They become windows into a deeper relationship with God. So I think that's a huge distinction we need to make. And then artists need to not expect the church to give them a show and all of this stuff. That's what the professional art world is for. Now, some churches run galleries, and that's like a part of their ministry, and that's different. So I think artists should come with a heart to serve, not the heart to make me famous. It's true in music, it's true in vocal, it's true in visual. Absolutely. All of it. We come to serve the body of this community, rather than use it as a platform for my greatness.
Right. Well, and Jesus didn't use his platform for his greatness. He was the servant of all servants. Right. And so if we're supposed to look like him, like that's, But we're human. Correct. I had a question off of that so the devotional like art, how would you distinguish that?
Intent. The first thing, the intent of the artist is to create something that helps lead people into a deeper sense of worship and prayer and experience. Often professional art, the intent is to speak to an issue or concerns about emotional healing or politics or all these other things. They're all great. But that's a different intent. Totally. And then the way it looks isn't as important as what's behind it. But I think also it's not the place for politics, right? It's a place for community connection. So I've done things like I went to a church up in Green Bay, and we took a photograph of a sunset in their town and divided up into all these small panels, and each person painted one element, and then assembled the whole thing back together.
That's beautiful.
It was really a great workshop and experience where everyone got to be a part of this community sense of, is it sunset? Is it sunrise? Is it both? Do we see Christ rising in us or setting, or it's both, right?
Mm-hmm.
Every ending is actually a beginning.
Mm-hmm.
So we were playing with all that, and I spoke in the church about that. It was really fun.
That's so cool.
There's something about allowing people to express themselves as part of the community experience.
Yeah.
And then you don't have to worry about everyone being too creative. Everyone's welcome at the table.
Yeah, because sometimes people could be like, well, I'm not artistic.
Right.
Which isn't, I would say, is not true. But like we can often limit ourselves to like, that's not my gifting, or like I'm not good at that either because we haven't explored it, or like, I mean, yes, the Lord gives us all different giftings, and so you are much more gifted in the creative arts than I am, but my outlet is music, and that's a different thing than a lot of the hand visual arts that you do, and that doesn't mean I'm not creative. It's just a different creative outlet, and even outside of what we would distinguish as art, like people are creative in how they create slides and how they create a conversation and how they create a sermon even, and like people forget that so much creativity is not limited to what we often put it into a box, which creativity shouldn't be in a box.
Have you ever heard of Francis Schaeffer, the theologian from the 60s and 70s?
A little bit. Yeah.
He wrote this great book called How Shall We Then Live? Now, his wife, Edith Schaeffer, wrote a really cool, small little book called Hidden Art. And how do you live creatively when you set your table, when you arrange your house, when you invite people over with hospitality? She does this beautiful job of bringing the creative aspect of God into everything we do. And it requires thoughtfulness and planning. You know, what kind of bowls do you use? What kind of napkins? I mean, all those things make a difference.
Totally.
And the idea of hidden art, that the art of life is connected. And the part of the problem is here in the West, in America, we want it fast, we want it easy, we want it techno, we want all these things, right? And creativity takes time and thoughtfulness.
It's a process.
Yeah, and I think if we can help people slow down a little bit and see that God is very patient, right? We keep thinking Jesus is coming, and it's been over 2,000 years. God's not in a hurry. He wants to transform us. He's very patient with us. And I think when we move too quickly,
we miss.
So I think the other part about the arts is they tend towards contemplation. Right. And the contemplative life is more about being quiet before God and hearing God rather than filling the air with our words to God. Right. I've been deeply influenced by Richard Rohr and his beautiful look at contemplation, and other writers as well. But it's hard to do that. We're all moving so quickly. There's so much going on, and there's so many shows to binge. I mean, right? We end up just distracting ourselves. And I think one of the problems is that when we're quiet, we face ourselves. The distractions keep us from experiencing either the pain or the struggle we're in. And when we're quiet, it needs to be dealt with and sat with. There's this great Midwestern kind of way of thinking. You just sit with people. You don't give them answers. You don't give them verses. You just sit with them. And what a difference.
And I think oftentimes, when we slow down and we sit, that's when the Lord's voice becomes that louder voice that we miss the whisper. The whisper becomes louder in the silence. And it's like when you're in class and you're supposed to be quiet and people are whispering, it's like you can hear it.
Everything.
But, and so it's like, okay, if we're actually quiet, like we can hear God loud and clear. How do you, when you're creating and when you're creating with an intent of worship upon the Lord, how do you go about that process yourself?
I think it has to be done very prayerfully intentionally, prayerfully, and seeking to create an environment or an experience that helps people, I like to use the word settle, helps them settle into God. And that usually means trying to block out some of the distractions. I've done this thing with muslin cloth and used panels under like an oak tree, and then put quilts down and invite people to enter in and stay. I leave blank journals and pencils on the ground for them. Last time I did it, one guy was there for 6 hours.
Wow.
Because it's so unusual to enter a space that you're invited to sit. And the breeze was blowing, so all the muslin was moving. It was fabulous.
That's awesome.
So how I go about it is I think, okay, what can I do? I spoke once in a chapel, and I spoke about the seasons of God and resting in God and hearing God. Then I hid journals and pencils all over campus.
That's fun.
And then people went out searching. They were in hedges, they were on benches, they were everywhere. I carried them with me, so if people ran up to me, I could give them one. Because the journal becomes this like miniature studio, a place for thoughts, for unedited thinking, right? So often we hesitate to write because we put down the wrong word.
Right, or we think like, oh, someone's going to read this, but if you block that out of like, this is just going to be my mess.
Right.
And you're more productive that way.
Right. And when we draw, sometimes the marks are wrong, so we erase more than we draw, to realize that every mark we make is a language that God knows. Every word we write is a little drawing that has meaning. And we just have agreed what those meanings are, where other marks we haven't agreed yet what they mean. So, but all marks are language.
Right.
And God knows all languages. So it's almost like when they talk about praying in the Spirit, when you don't even know what you're saying, it's just coming out. You can draw the same way. The marks are just part of our internal groaning, our internal longing to connect. Yeah, it's really powerful.
That's awesome. As we go to our last question, for any artist out there or any person, what advice would you give them for the creative process for connecting with God as we close today?
I feel like we just got started.
Yeah.
My suggestion would be is, first and foremost, try not to be self-critical about whatever process you pick, whether it's knitting, sewing, drawing, watercolor, dancing around a public fountain. Whatever it is, whatever movement you want to make that's creative, give yourself so much grace and so much room to be like a child again. Jesus was very clear when he said, unless you repent and become like a child, you will not enter the kingdom of God. Yeah. So children are naturally creative. For us to find that childlike wonder where the scribble drawings that children make and are describing their time at the beach last summer, and all we see is a mass of color, to go back to that place where before God we can scribble. We can trust that our creativity will be honored and received, not with our perfectionism, not with what should look right, but what comes out of us. So that'd be my foremost thought.
I love that. Awesome. Well, thank you. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Taylor. It's been great.
Hey, thank you so much for listening to this week's episode on our podcast. This was our third episode of our series, Avenues of Worship Through the Arts, and we discussed with Bill Catling the many different visual art forms that he has experience in and how inside and outside of the church we can use that to glorify God. If you liked this video, click that like button and subscribe to our channel. We'll see you soon.